You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Jazz Cabbage. I'm your host, Chala June, and as a bona fide nerd who has spent the majority of their career working in and writing about the culinary arts, I have clocked countless hours of research into the science of food. Now, I'll admit a huge chunk of this research has been purely recreational, especially as a kid when I had to be peeled away from the TV anytime Good Eats with Alton Brown was on. But even in my professional career, I've delighted in the endless pursuit of more culinary knowledge, diving deep into the internet archives to learn more about why Sichuan peppercorns make your tongue tingle, how turmeric can regulate inflammation in the body, and the ways in which helpful bacteria found in fermented foods can make both our gut and our brains happier. Recently, the explosion of cannabis-infused food and drink has really been piquing my scientific interest. I'm someone who smokes weed pretty regularly, and I've always been curious as to why eating an edible, say a pot brownie or gummy, can feel 5 times as intense as puffing down an entire joint. It turns out there's a lot of science behind infusing cannabis compounds like THC and CBD into our food and drinks. And things get even more complex when we look at how these compounds are processed by our bodies. Unfortunately, it can be overwhelming and intimidating to parse through all this scientific jargon involved, like decarboxylation, endocannabinoid, and bioavailability, just to have a better understanding of how edibles actually work. But luckily for you, my little cabbages, I asked Boston-born attorney, entrepreneur, and patented inventor Shanel Lindsay to take us to school and guide us through everything you need to know to pass Edibles 101. This is part 1 of our 2-part exploration into the science of cooking and eating weed. I'm here with Shanel Lindsay, who is an attorney, entrepreneur, inventor, and the founder of Ardent Cannabis, a Boston-based biotech and medical device company. Shanel, welcome to Jazz Cabbage. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Chala, thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
I know I just gave the Cliff Notes version of your bio, but please feel free to introduce yourself in your own words.
Oh, amazing. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Shanel Lindsay. I am an attorney, an inventor, a mom, a medical cannabis advocate, an adult use cannabis advocate, really somebody who is wanting to educate and help people understand how to use plant medicine, specifically cannabis, when it comes to both their mental and physical health. I'm from Boston originally, but I'm living out in LA now. And like you mentioned, I have Ardent, which is a company that really is a result of my passion for that education and access for people when it comes to cannabis. And I've been running that company for 10 years now. So really happy to be here, talking with you about all things plant medicine.
Yes, and running a company in the cannabis space for over 10 years is no small feat, not at all. It's an industry where there's a lot of turnover, so that is really something worth congratulating you for. So how have you been over this past year? What have you been working on?
Oh, this last year, like all years, has been another dog year in cannabis, which means that it seems like it's been 7 years in one single year because there's still a lot of education that needs to be done around how cannabis can be used. The great thing is that more and more people have access to cannabis and are using it. But when it comes down to the different ways that you can utilize the plant, everything from, what people usually understand, issues with pain and inflammation and nausea and other things like that, but also in really preventative ways like suppositories for all types of, issues that women have when it comes to menstrual cycles or ovarian issues, all the way to over-the-counter like acne and facial treatments where people aren't necessarily thinking of those things right out of the gate. Our mission is really to make people understand like the complete utility of cannabis, right? The fact that it really can come in and help in ways that may be really surprising to people.
I love that you mentioned acne and skincare because I started using CBD skincare a couple years ago, and especially living in New York City and dealing with all of the air pollution, the anti-inflammation that CBD had on my skin really helped keep things nice and clean and clear. So I want to talk a bit more about Ardent, specifically about these incredible devices that you've invented. And when I first learned about Ardent was, I think, almost 2 years ago now. And I think that was when we had first met at the Marijuana Business Convention in Vegas, which is an eye-opening environment and was a very interesting experience. But I can get into that at a different point. That might be a separate podcast. But I was so excited not only to see this proud Black woman-owned business in that very white male-dominated space, but also to learn about these sleek, sophisticated magic infusion machines that have been nicknamed the Easy Bake Oven of weed. So I would love for you to tell our listeners more about the Ardent devices and what really led you to creating them.
Yes, I've been using cannabis as a medicine for over 25 years now. So my son is 23, and after he was born, I got an ovarian cyst. And this ovarian cyst was causing me a lot of pain, a lot of inflammation. And when I went to the doctor, they prescribed me really, really high doses of acetaminophen for, I guess, my entire life, right? And I did some research into that and was very concerned about how it was going to impact my liver and long term. And I thought I could probably do something that is, healthier for me. And just an aside about the acetaminophen and the liver issue, I was right being concerned about that because just a few years ago, the American Medical Association came out with a report showing that acetaminophen, Tylenol, and high doses of that were a contributing factor in 1 out of 3 liver failures were caused by acetaminophen overuse. And one of the things that's really interesting, especially of how we think about and we treat cannabis versus other, medicines, when you think about something like a Tylenol, where if you just take really twice of the recommended dosage, even in 1 or 2 times, you can damage your liver. And we have a substance like that's available readily over the counter without any kind of, guardrails up for it. But then you have something like cannabis, which is non-toxic when it comes to, that respect in your liver and can be helpful in many different ways. And you don't have access to that. But I had been using cannabis at that point for quite a while, even though I was young when I had my son, but I had been using cannabis to help me focus, help me study. But at that point, I was really just smoking. And when I got my ovarian cyst, it was not just acetaminophen that I was being prescribed, but also painkillers, which I was concerned about becoming addicted to. I decided to look into using cannabis instead. And I knew that, out in California, folks were using it primarily for nausea reduction. But I also understood that folks were getting really good pain and inflammation relief as well. And so I started researching and making edibles and topicals in my home. And that's really how I started my journey into the cannabis science, right? But like many people, when I started making edibles and topicals and suppositories at that point, all of those were working really well for me. I was very frustrated by a couple things. Number one, I was having to eat a lot of butter. and oil. And I was very concerned because I would take my butter and I would put it in a little bit of oatmeal. And then I realized, Shanel, you're eating 3 extra meals a day because you're incorporating this cannabis. So that was one challenge. The other challenge was that I was not getting consistency in my products, right? Sometimes my butter was strong and it was, giving me relief. Sometimes my suppositories were strong. Sometimes they weren't. And it was a big challenge in getting that consistency. And so over the course of 10 years, I was just doing my thing, making my products. And then I got access to a laboratory. And at that point, I was also beginning to teach other people about how to make products, because by that time I had become a lawyer and everything as well. So I was, becoming very analytical. And I was thinking about how I really didn't understand or know how much was in my butter or oil, right? And that always bothered me. I knew I could use the same amount of cannabis, but like I mentioned, I wasn't getting consistency in that output, and I wasn't able to pinpoint how many milligrams that I had. And that was a big challenge. People were moving towards medical marijuana in Massachusetts, but there was a big stigma around, is this really medicine? Because you can't ever tell what's actually in it. And so I got access to a laboratory and I went and I started testing my medicine. And what many people don't understand is, if you want to make cannabis edibles and topicals, the THC and the CBD that you're looking for in this nug is actually locked under an acid layer. And so if you were just to eat this bud right now, you wouldn't get high from it. Right. And so there's this process called decarboxylation, and it's a intimidating sounding word, but all it means is removing the acid layer so that THC and CBD are active and it can interact with your endocannabinoid system. And so while I knew about decarboxylation, like many people, I thought that it kind of automatically happened when you reached a certain temperature in the oven. And I didn't realize that decarb is actually a pretty complicated process, but that's what I realized when I went to this laboratory and started testing my medicine. What I saw was that the oven and the kitchen appliances weren't doing this full activation of the decarb, right? Only about half of it was getting activated, which meant that if I could get 200 milligrams out of this nug, I was only getting 100 milligrams out of it, right? And that was also accounting for this discrepancy that I was seeing in sometimes my edibles working well and sometimes them not. And so that was a real light bulb moment when I saw in the laboratory, not only that the kitchen appliances weren't getting there, but that then when I did other tests in the lab, just with the very, very specific lab equipment where I could heat things very evenly and perfectly and really dial in the temperature and in the environment, that I was actually able to get 97 to 100% decarboxylation, right? And so that meant that I was getting all of the active ingredients out. And so at that point, I knew, I was like, oh man, if I can make a machine that can replicate these laboratory conditions, then any person could be able to get the most out of their cannabis material. And so that was the genesis and the beginning of developing the Ardent products. And here is the end result, which is a decarboxylator that allows people, to do just that at home.
And that's such an incredible and impactful journey, because not only is it just about empowering people to be able to infuse and make their own infusions at home, but it's also really taking into account that cannabis can be expensive and it can be really important for people to get full use of whatever it is they have access to. And that can often cause barriers for a lot of people, especially when we think about infusing food. A lot of people have experiences with infusing a batch of brownies, and one time they make them and they're in the stratosphere, and another time they make them and they're like, this edible's not doing a single thing for me. And there's so much inconsistency, and that's something that gets written off when we talk about recreational cannabis, but there are so many medical patients, there are so many medical uses for this plant that people rely on it for. And so it's really cool and really important that you've invented this incredible device that allows people to get as much medicine out of the plant as possible. Because like you said, there are people who turn to cannabis in order to maintain their body systems in a way that doesn't make them fully reliant on pharmaceuticals in certain ways. And I will reinforce and continue to reinforce that we are not doctors. If you are suffering from any medical issues and are considering using cannabis or not for them, please consult your physician and your primary care doctor. I am not a medical professional. That being said, all of our bodies have this really important endocannabinoid system, which are these cannabis receptors that CBD and THC and these different cannabinoids really are drawn to that can help us maintain stasis in the body. So I would love to have you speak more to specifically the endocannabinoid system and what being able to use a device like Ardent to get as much medicine out of the plant as possible can really do for helping people create their own home care routines.
Yeah, Chala, you hit the nail on the head when it comes to our primary purpose. And the reason that I started Ardent was for the medical patients and for patients to get access. When it comes down to adult use and recreational use, it's amazing. It's fun. I often talk about it as like glasses, right? Like sometimes people are wearing glasses for fashion and it's great. It's awesome. It's amazing. And then some of us need glasses to live, right? And when I think about cannabis and access to cannabis, often it's like that for folks. And when I first started out with Ardent, that was the biggest problem and challenge was that there were so many people that could benefit from this, but the fear of not doing it the right way or them actually making products and that not getting the result from it. But the reason why they're not getting the result from it is because there's not even the cannabinoids that they thought were in there, right? And when I was in the laboratory, when we were doing this initial testing and I was developing Ardent, there's one story that really sticks out to me. There was a gentleman who came in and he was trying to test some medicine and his wife was a doctor and she had gotten a very severe form of epilepsy that was keeping her from practicing. And she was having a lot of seizures and he decided he was going to make some cannabis medicine for her. And he came into the lab and tested it. And can I tell you that there was not one bit of THC or CBD in the medicine that he made? Not one. He had burnt it all off in the process. And that was a very moving moment for me because I thought, and it really underscored the need for something like Ardent because you had folks that were reaching out to this plant that could have benefited from it that really would turn away because they thought it didn't work when they actually never even accessed the plant, right? And for me at that point, I had been making cannabis medicine for over a decade at that point, and there were still challenges I was having, right? And so I thought people are not going to be able to access this medicine if there isn't a way where they feel comfort in it too, right? Because cannabis has been illegal and it's been stigmatized for so long that there's actually not a lot of real information about it. And so that was something, in addition to actually having access to the technology, actually having access to information was a big barrier to folks. I love legal cannabis. I love the fact that there are dispensaries and people have access, but dispensary product can be very expensive. And frankly, a lot of people don't have access to dispensaries still here in the US and around the world, right? And so having a technology that levels the playing field and allows people, even if they just have a little bit left over from a joint that they're smoking, or if they have access from their own home grow, that's something that we advocate for as well, right? That people can grow at home and that they can gift to other patients, because people that are suffering from medical conditions already have such a financial burden in their lives from the challenges from their medical issues, right? The last thing we need is for people to have the medicine be expensive and out of reach. And there are actually many people and doctors that I talk to who have gotten people off of opiates onto and using cannabis instead, where their patients actually have to go back to opiates because they cannot afford the cannabis treatment. Right. And so it can be, especially for people who have high doses, right? When you're talking about on the dispensary side, often there is a limit of 5 or 10 milligrams per serving. And if you have somebody who needs 500 or 1,000 milligrams because they're using it during a course of cancer treatment, it becomes untenable for people. And so having that be accessible for folks. And so, like I said, if you're paying $10 a gram for a gram of cannabis and you can get 2 200 milligrams out of that for making edibles, that starts to be more affordable for people. And then when you're talking about growing at home, you can use in our device, you can use flower, you can use keef, you can use even sugar leaf, you can use stems. Stems have cannabinoids in them as well. So it really allows you to use all different parts of the plant in order to get more out of it. The beauty of cannabis is that we all have a natural endocannabinoid system. And I like to think about the endocannabinoid system kind of like the lymphatic system, meaning that people have been taught about your lymph nodes and your lymphatic system and how it's all throughout your body. People and even doctors aren't really taught about the endocannabinoid system. Now they are, which I also think is a great testament to our movement, that many medical schools now have programs around cannabis and now have begun speaking about the endocannabinoid system. But when you think about it, your endocannabinoid system is all throughout your body. It helps to modulate and regulate many different systems. A lot of people are skeptical when you talk about cannabis being used for all these different things. They say, how could one plant be used for all of these different things? It must be fake. Right. And like you mentioned, we are not doctors. And let's be clear that cannabis is not a panacea or cure for everything, but it is incredibly helpful in many conditions, in a wide variety of conditions, because of the way that the endocannabinoid system operates. So we have these natural endocannabinoids in our system, and they do many different things. But one of their most important features is to control and to kill, actually. And when I say control and kill, it's control and kill cellular activities. And so our body naturally needs to quiet down and reset. And our natural endocannabinoids do that for us. So one example is in cancer cells. Our cancer is caused by an overproduction of our own cells. When our own cells do not know it's time to die, they keep moving and they keep going, and then they create cancer, which causes us issues, right? And so our natural endocannabinoid system works to stop those cells from reproducing. Same thing with different other areas of homeostasis. Another great example is for mental health. So one main cause of PTSD is ruminating thoughts. So neurons firing when they shouldn't be firing and recalling different memories. And so our natural endocannabinoid system comes in and tells those neurons like, shh, quiet, it's not time for you to fire off. And so cannabis comes in because cannabis, we mostly know about THC and CBD and CBG, and they're kind of some like prime time cannabinoids, but there are over 80 plus different cannabinoids within the cannabis plant. And when they go into our body, they're able to essentially fit into these receptors in our endocannabinoid system where maybe our natural endocannabinoids are not doing that. And so it can come in, and that's why cannabis is great for sleep. It's great for bringing homeostasis to chaos, essentially. So when you think about those two things together, which is that we have this incredible endocannabinoid system that can be activated and modulated where it's deficient with cannabis, and then we have this amazing, plant that if we access it the right way and we prepare it the right way, then our body can be ready to receive it. You can see how important it is for us to do it right here on the front end and then understand more about the different cannabinoids. So whatever the challenge is in our body, we can find that right customized blend to help us. And that's another, great thing about the technology. And one of the reasons that I developed it was because often like in dispensaries, there's a focus on THC, right? Everybody's focused on THC in the recreational market, and THC is fantastic. In fact, THC is the primary driver in many therapies, but adding CBD, CBG can really take it to the next level and be what people need to relieve different issues, right? And so having a device and having access to technology where you can activate all different strains and all different types of cannabis products and then blend those together to make customized therapies just for you or what your family needs, that was something that was very important to me in the process as well.
Back in a flash with more Jazz Cabbage. Welcome back, my little cabbages, to more Jazz Cabbage. Like you mentioned, a lot of the fear that people feel around using cannabis, around infusing food with cannabis, comes from a
Yes.
lack of information and a lack of knowledge because the plant has been so stigmatized for decades. And because of that stigma, people have felt like cannabis is so inaccessible. They've kind of turned it into a boogeyman. But also on the flip side of that, now that we're starting to get more information, there's also this big marketing push where people are trying to put cannabis out there as, like you said, this panacea, this cure-all, and you can use it for every single thing, where that's not the case. The case is that it is this incredible medicine that can help
Yes.
support the other medicines that we are using, help support the other things that we are doing to take care of our bodies. And so, in talking about plant medicine specifically, I really want to bring food into the conversation because food is kind of the OG plant medicine when we think about superfoods and when we think about the big ashwagandha trend that is starting to happen and that's been happening in the US. And we look at foods like turmeric, we look at foods like acai, we look at these different things that are being touted as these miracle foods. And while there's a merit to that, there is also a merit to being able to use those in conjunction with other plant medicines like cannabis. And so I'd really love to hear you speak to why someone would turn specifically to infusing cannabis into their food and why using a device like Ardent is so important, not only for getting all the medicine out, but like you said, for having those accurate dosages as well.
Absolutely, yes. And the old adage, food is medicine, it's really true because what we're putting into our bodies daily is what's defining how our bodies are running. And I kind of think of cannabis as the crown jewel of the plant medicines. And with cannabis too, like you mentioned, it really is an adjunct to our other modern medicines. And many times its effectiveness, depends on these other factors in your life, like how healthy you are otherwise, how early you start to incorporate cannabis and cannabinoids into a therapy where you may not need intervention by Western medicine, but you very well may need to because an issue may be way too far along for cannabis and cannabinoids alone to reverse something, even where it may have prevented it, right? So there's all of these, different pieces there, but incorporating cannabis into food is, I think, the easiest way for people to have it as part of their routine. And I think it's also an incredible way to remind people that while we are nourishing our bodies, that is what our bodies using to grow, to fight off disease, and all of those flow in together. And like I mentioned before, one of the challenges that I had was eating too much butter and oil when I was making edibles and topicals the traditional way. And that was because I, like many people, had conflated this issue of making a butter or an oil and activating cannabis and that decarboxylation I talked about. And before, because there wasn't a lot of education or science around it, people, I think, thought you had to, and many people I think still believe that you need to extract cannabis into an oil or a butter in order to be able to use it, right? And that actually isn't true. Once you activate, basically the device here has multiple sensors in it, so we're controlling the temperature in here to a laboratory grade level. And then there is a heater that wraps all the way around the entire device. So unlike an oven or a toaster oven where you're just heating on the bottom and you're getting like these hot spots, this is creating like a really controlled environment where we can control the temperature, evenly heat everything inside, and do that full activation of the cannabinoids. But when it comes out, it is still in the same form when it went in. And we have a little lifter so you can decarb multiple things at a time or different strains at a time. But with this activated decarb flower, right now, this is an edible, meaning that it has active THC. And just taking a tiny bit of it, so I mentioned this has about 200 milligrams per gram. So if I wanted 20 milligrams, that's a 0.1. It's just a very small amount. So you can start to see how people can get a lot of runway with their product, even with very little. And again, that's a huge cost savings for people. But right now, if I just took this and sprinkled it right in my food, now my food would be an edible. And so I don't have to go and have a butter or an oil. I can if I want to. Sometimes you like butter and oil for a certain recipe or other things like that. But the idea is that you really don't have to change your eating habits. You can actually incorporate cannabinoids right into your food. And when you're talking about this amount, you're not tasting it. It's a very small amount. It's almost like putting a little bit of salt or pepper on your food. And now that really opens up the opportunities for people. And it's that simple, right? So now you don't have to become this culinary expert in order to use cannabis. You don't have to worry if you've done it right. Like that process of activating this is putting it in the machine, pressing the button, waiting till the cycle's done, and then taking it out. And so that really, I think, changed the game for many people when it came down to just completely removing that barrier between the culinary side of things and how do I do it right on the cannabis side. People, like when we first started out, and even now, people will say, I used to take an ounce of cannabis and put it in the oven and like hope for the best. And I'm just like, wow, that's hundreds of dollars where you could have, activated like 1 or 2 grams and got what you wanted out of it. And we often say that we have this like theme of just start with a gram. Just take 1 gram of flour, put it in, and that's not a lot of risk for people, right? If you just say, hey, just take a gram and see what you can do with it versus this very daunting idea of, oh my goodness, I have to get hundreds of dollars of cannabis in order to use it. And what if I don't do it right or whatever? And so this is really our goal, which is just to completely streamline this and then leave it up to people and the culinary genius of how people can think of incorporating this into their world.
And you can also bake in the device as well.
Yes, you can definitely bake in the device. And I actually have something baking. It's in the other room right now. But yes, you can actually bake little cupcakes. You can melt chocolate and then make chocolate covered infused strawberries. You can bake and melt and do anything that you want in the device. And that's why we're really excited about the app coming out, because it really takes people through that entire process of, step 1, step 2, and it actually controls the machine for you. So even less worry for folks that are new to this. And then once folks get comfortable, it's really the sky is the limit, right? Being able to make, whether it is infusing right into the food or taking this and putting it right into capsules and making capsules. A lot of people, what we found is that cannabis is a very personal thing. And it also is very much tied into people's rituals. And people are more excited and more into incorporating cannabis, especially folks that are like family and friends that are interested, but like a little bit on the edge. If you're able to help them incorporate that into their daily routine and they don't have to change anything, then that really takes away the stigma and the fear around cannabis. And they really realize, wow, this is something that, this could be for me. And that's what we noticed too, that people are very loyal to the ways that they do things and in their different rituals. And that was something that we really wanted to do, is have a technology and different accessories and other things that allowed people to just seamlessly incorporate into their life. So if they're cooks and they're cooking all the time, then it's super easy to use. We call this instant edible, which is as soon as it comes out, it is instantly an edible and you can just sprinkle it and put it on. Or if they want to infuse, you can infuse in the device. That's just as simple as when this comes out, pouring your butter and oil in and then pressing the button. And then we have different strainers and, infusion presses and other things like that for people to do. Or if they want to put it into capsules or if they use suppositories. But the idea was that with our device, you can make any particular product for any person and really bridge that gap for them immediately and open their eyes to, oh, wow, I may have thought of cannabis in this very narrow way, but wow, this is something that is great for me and can really improve my life and my health.
And that's something that I really love about this sort of Swiss Army knife type device that you've invented, is that there are so many applications that do fit into every single person's lifestyle, depending on what their own personal choices are. And it can be really difficult for people who are curious about cannabis and want to engage with it and interact with it to then be given these very prescriptive and, like you said, narrow ways to interact with the plant. And even a story from my own personal life, my grandfather, rest his soul, he's no longer with us, but towards the end of his life, he had cancer and he was really struggling not only with pain management and with sleep, but also with appetite. And he was in Detroit, and I have an incredible cousin, Aaliyah, who is a cannabis chef and was making infused butter to take over to him week after week. And just a little knob of that butter on a pancake or in his grits with his breakfast completely changed his mood, completely opened up his appetite, like helped make him comfortable in those last few weeks. And so seeing that from my own grandfather, who was a Baptist deacon, just be able to be open-minded to engaging with cannabis in this intentional way because he was able to incorporate it into the routines that he already had. And just the difference that made was something that was really incredible for all of us to witness. And so it really feels so important that a device like this exists so that people can be empowered to incorporate it into their routines and be empowered, even if you're not necessarily making it for yourself, to make it for a loved one, to gift it to a loved one and see how it can help improve their life in, like you said, these very personal ways, because cannabis is very personal. And something else that I find really inspiring, not only about this, but about your story, is that you hold, I believe, 5 patents for the device.
Yes, yes. So that is, it's really awesome when you kind of find inspiration in something and then also realize that it's a new and novel thing that, no one's thought of before. And one of the things that was always really important for me and is important now is just protecting people's access, right? We have dispensaries. We also have kind of like big tobacco looking to move into cannabis and big pharma looking to move in. And it's funny because right when I started Ardent, there was a cannabis medicine that was being brought to the market that was a pump spray of 0.25 milligrams of THC and 0.25 milligrams of CBD. It was the first cannabis pharmaceutical. And this pharmaceutical cost $1,200 for a monthly supply. And if you actually calculate that dosage, right, we were getting people that dosage in less than $10 at home. So that was something that was so important for us, was to be able to make sure that everyone would be able to access technology that they could make anything that they needed in like these custom cannabinoid blends. And so when I started Ardent and I was looking into technology that I needed to build, I really realized nothing like this existed before. I'm a little guy, right? Like I'm a woman with a dream and an idea, but when it comes down to it, funding for my business was not from some big VC funding or anything like that. It was very much, friends and family and angels that, believed in me. And so it was important at the beginning to go and protect what I was building up. And so I went, and like I mentioned, I'm an attorney. And so it was really a second education for me as a lawyer to get that knowledge of how to approach patents and how to get protection, on your products and devices. And there have definitely been products that have come out that have infringed on our patent that we've had to go after and been successful at getting off of the market. And that's been a very interesting journey, but I'm very happy and proud and honored to be able to, have patents on the device, and just another indication that this was something important that was needed. And hopefully, again, people continue to, benefit from it.
And that's such an inspiration, because I think it can be easy to take our good ideas for granted, especially as people of color, especially women, especially Black people. It can be really easy to have a great idea and just be like, oh, well, I couldn't have been the first person to have this idea, or, oh, well, it's just like my own little thing. But it really is so important to think, no, this is a great idea. This is something that not only I feel aligned with, but that I know that people need, and to really take those steps to make sure that you have protection over it, that you have ownership of it. I mean, I can't even recount how many stories there are of Black inventors who we know invented a thing, but then someone else took it and got the patent and is credited for that through history. So it's so inspiring to be able to talk to you about really that process and making sure that you have ownership of your ideas and of your stuff. And as we wrap up here, during my research, I found this really great quote from a profile of you in Gossamer, where you said, I have a bit of a type A personality. I have a lot of drive and ambition, and that can come with a lot of stress and anxiety. Cannabis helped me focus while I was working hard. There can be a fine line between thinking and analyzing being positive or negative. I always found that cannabis helped me stay on the path of positivity, creativity, and order. It can be a fast friend in that way. And I really loved that quote because I'm like, yes, cannabis is my bestie, but also something that, as someone who also deals with anxiety and uses cannabis to quiet the chatter, I find that it's important to also actively be combating these lazy stoner stereotypes.
Oh, yeah.
Because a lot of what puts people off from cannabis is this idea that they're going to consume and they're not going to be able to do anything with their day. They're just going to be floating in the clouds. And so as we kind of put a bow on this conversation, and especially speaking to you as an attorney, a patented inventor, an advocate, I would love to hear you speak to how cannabis has helped you be more creative and more productive in the face of these sort of lazy stoner stereotypes.
Yes, absolutely. I love that quote too. That was very heartfelt. In my personal experience, that has really been the way. And I think that it's interesting because cannabis does impact people in different ways physiologically, right? And one of the things that I've come to learn over these last 20 years is that I am a very heavy cannabis user, and meaning that my body physiologically, I can handle a lot of different cannabinoids. And maybe in many ways, my body is deficient in many cannabinoids. And I have a very strong history of depression and different mental illnesses in my family. And when looking back on different folks and looking at your genetics, cannabis can affect you in different ways, right? So I know for me, I can smoke joint after joint and do work and it wouldn't be a problem. There may be another person where they take 2 puffs of a joint and they're out for the day. And so I think that when we think about cannabis use, we can't think about it in a vacuum, and we can't use certain people or examples of entire community. And just like anything, too much of an extreme isn't good, right? And can cause a problem. And I think that's the same with cannabis as well, whether it's the use of cannabis or even the thought of people who use cannabis and being that too of an extreme. And so on one hand, you can't call and say everybody who uses cannabis or people that habitually use cannabis are lazy stoners, because now there is such a repertoire of people who are high functioning, highly creative, highly successful people that have come out and say, no, I use cannabis. I use it regularly. I use it in all of these different ways. And so cannabis is very nuanced, but for me particularly, and many people that I know that are very high achievers, but have some of these, potential mental health challenges, or the tendency to kind of lean a little sad, or the tendency to lean a little bit depressed or anxious, cannabis can come in and really be a reminder that those thoughts are not us. Right. And that mindset, and I'm a huge mindset person. Mindset is a driver of everything in life, right? And it again then does come back to your physical. So I think that when it comes down to, for me particularly, cannabis has been something that I've relied on rather than pharmaceuticals. And so for me, cannabis has very much been not only a medicine, but also a creative outlet, and also something that has, helped me when it comes down to interacting with other folks and educating other people. So yes, cannabis is my best friend, for other folks that have looked out and maybe had the experience of, oh, well, I take a puff and I would never be able to do anything. Well, that's your experience, and maybe incorporating cannabis into your everyday and work doesn't work for you, but saying that it's not effective for somebody else or categorizing us as less than certainly isn't the right way to think about it either. So those are kind of my thoughts when it comes to the stigma that's still around cannabis, because I do feel like that there is some nuance. Cannabis isn't a perfect match for everybody's biology. And I think that is something, I think when people understand and know that piece, right? I think that's probably the most important point that I'd like to make, is that when people understand that their experience with cannabis may be different than others, it may open their eyes to the fallacy of their, thoughts around lazy stoners.
Absolutely. Beautifully, beautifully said. And something that motivates me a lot in this work of bringing cannabis conversations into the zeitgeist, into the mainstream, and especially to these audiences in the food world who tend to have this understanding that there is a world that is vast and wide out there, and that there are all of these decisions that we can make. Not everybody's gonna like French food, not everybody's gonna like Mexican food, but we're not inherently gonna say, oh, one food is worse than the other. I mean, some people will say it, but that's not my MO. And it's really beautiful to think about how having these conversations allows us to empower people to make ethical choices for themselves.
Yes.
And bringing people information gives them the power to say, okay, this might be for me, or actually it's not for me, but I know why it's not for me. That, I think, is the most important part of this conversation for me personally, is creating platforms to tell stories and share information around cannabis so that people can be informed consumers. Because the last thing anyone wants to do is have the wool pull over their eyes. And like you said, especially in this dispensary era where it is becoming more legal, there's also a lot of marketing dollars being thrown into cannabis and a lot of misinformation that also might be out there for people to sway people to buy one product over another or one format over another. So having conversations like this is just so important and really fuels so much of my work. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining me on Jazz Cabbage and for sharing your wisdom and your work and your expertise with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chala. I really enjoyed being here. And one last thing on that lazy stoner piece and what you just mentioned about the vast nature of culinary experience and just human experience as well, too, is that, I think that when people have these narrow conversations, it's really a lack of education, right? Because when we think about cannabis, sure, THC may impact some people a certain way, but those same people that may not perform well under THC may have amazing benefits from like CBD or CBG or other things like that, right? And so understanding that there's just such a wide breadth to cannabis and the ways that it can be used, as I often say, like, I'm not going to yuck your yum. And I think that that's when it comes down to cannabis as well, too. Just because something is working amazing for me, it doesn't work for you. You wouldn't deny me my benefits because it's not the thing that you prefer, right? And so I love and so appreciate your continued dedication to the industry, to exploring all of these pieces. And, I'm just very grateful.
The gratitude and the honor is truly all mine. So before jumping off, I just want to ask where our listeners can find and keep up with your work.
Yeah, so check us out at Ardent Cannabis. It's ARDENT, so passionate about everything. PassionateCannabis.com. So yes, Ardent Cannabis. And then also check us out on Instagram, Ardent LLC or Ardent Herbal. And I'm Shanel Lindsay. You can check out what I'm doing as well, not only in the cannabis tech, but also in the protecting small businesses and people's access to cannabis. So check us out at Parabola Center, where we're doing our work, and everybody can join in with the push on the federal side to legalize cannabis, but also make sure that people and patients and the community continues to have the best access.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Check out our show notes to learn more about our guests and other cannabis resources. Jazz Cabbage is produced by Taylor Early, H. Conley, and me, Chala June. Our audio engineers are H. Conley, Gabriel Jean, and Armin Spengen. Sound design and mixing is by Sam Gerardi. Jazz Cabbage is powered by Simplecast. Jazz Cabbage, hosted by Chala June, is a production of Heritage Radio Network. Food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe. For more Jazz Cabbage shenanigans, find us on Instagram at JazzCabbagePod. If you want to drop me a note, you can write to the pod at jazzcabbagepodcast@gmail.com.